Half a Day Church, Pastor Jake here, and I want to do a special thank you for joining us in our second community groups. I got a lot of feedback from the first week, and it sounds like it went very well. I pray that you guys had some good time to connect with one another, got to share maybe a prayer request or two, pray with one another, have some good fellowship, and maybe even some snacks. But today, I have the pleasure of leading you guys in our first lesson in our one another's. Last week, Pastor gave an overview, kind of some big thoughts to hang a lot of what we're going to be talking on. But today, we are going to dive into focusing on one another. And before we do that, however, I want to set the stage for the remainder of the semester and even looking into the spring. So in organizing the curriculum, we had all of the one another's that we're trying to decide which ones will we focus on, and to kind of categorize them that made the most sense, we did 4 distinct groups. I have the pleasure of introducing the first category to you guys tonight, and as you can see on the screen, the first category is going to be having the right path to start on. Having the right path to start on. There are a number of one another's in the New Testament that address the situation when you first meet someone, or when you first greet someone in particular. What should that be like? What should that be defined by? What are the things we should be thinking about when we go to someone's house, when we go and meet someone just out in a social event, or even at church on Sunday morning? What are the things that can help us? That's this first category, and we're looking at it tonight. The second category is going to be called the hazardous paths to avoid. Simply put, this category are the things we should not do. Just like with anything in life, in order to know best what you should do, you need to make sure you know what you shouldn't do, and that's what that part 2 is going to be. Pastor Brian is actually going to launch that section next week, and then Pastor Josh after that. Our third grouping is going to be called the helpful paths to achieve. The helpful paths to achieve. This is the largest grouping in the New Testament of one another's, and these, as you can kind of hear it in the name, these are the things that we should be pursuing. The things that are very enjoyable even. Things like loving one another. Things like pursuing kindness towards one another. Things like singing and praying and serving, all of those things that we often think about. That's going to be that third grouping, and we'll spend a number of weeks on there. And then our fourth grouping, just so that you have it kind of in your mind, going into the spring, so not this fall, we're going to be hitting our fourth category, which is called the hard paths to accept. And I titled it that way because not that the other ones are easy, but these, in my mind, are some of the harder ones to actually do. This is the section where we get into bearing one another's burdens, confessing your sins, asking for forgiveness, and then offering forgiveness. Things that we should be doing all the time. So don't wait until then to live those out in your group, but certainly we are going to be spending some specific time later on those. And that will conclude this whole series on the one another's. But as I said at the beginning, we're going to be focusing on the first category, which is having the right path to start on. And what I want to do to transition your thoughts into the lesson is talk about, just for a second, the importance of a first impression. If you've ever been in a job interview, or if you've ever been interviewing someone for a job, or if you've ever met someone for the first time in a social gathering, at college, maybe in any arena, the first impression is the most important one for a number of reasons. If for no other reason, the first impression seems to last the longest. And if you've had a good one, you'll know what I mean by that. But certainly, if you've had a bad first impression with someone, or you've offered it, you will never forget that moment. So the first impressions last the longest, but also the first impressions are extremely important because we aren't guaranteed a second opportunity, a second chance. So in the business world, first impressions means you got one shot, and if you do well, you can keep that customer. In a similar sense, but maybe a different mindset in ministry, we're not guaranteed another opportunity with someone. So we want to make sure how we begin is on the right note. And for the sake of our outline, we are on the right path. So to think about, well, how should we start any interaction with a believer? We're going to be looking at Romans chapter 16, verse 16. It's a very familiar passage, and I'm just going to read it. And normally I would pray, but I'm actually going to leave it up to the group leader. Maybe they've already prayed, but to save time, I'm going to let them pray right after the lesson. And so to jump right in, if you're not there yet, Romans 16, verse 16, a very familiar command that you may have some questions about. So if you're there, read along with me. Greet one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ greet you. So this first topic we're going to be talking about is greeting to grow, and specifically greeting one another with a holy kiss. Why is greeting so important to get right? Greeting can set the tone for the entire relationship. It can set the tone certainly for the entire service, and absolutely for the entire conversation you have with someone. So we want to make sure how we are greeting people, we're putting thought into, we're building a theology about it from the Bible, and that we can live it out in effective and edifying ways. And so really this command has two parts and really two words that we're just going to spend the rest of the time on. And it's just those two words, holy kiss. Now, some of you may have never thought about this command, but I want to spend our time beginning with the second word and then unpacking it and seeing how it can relate to us today. So first of all, why is kissing significant? Specifically in the Bible, what does it say were the reasons why people would greet one another with a kiss? The first reason why kissing would be important or significant in biblical times is it communicates acceptance. Kissing communicates acceptance. If you look at Genesis 29:13, this is where Laban, who was the brother of Rebekah, heard about Jacob helping Rebekah, and the first thing he does is he runs to him. In verse 13, it says, he heard the news of Jacob about his sister's son. He ran to meet him, embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house. See, this first interaction that Laban had with Jacob, he wanted Jacob to know one thing: he was accepted. He was welcomed in his house. He was excited to have him, and he wanted him to know that in their house there was a place for him. A little bit later, we see in Genesis 33, Jacob was embraced by yet another man and kissed. And if you see in 33, verse 4, this was Esau now. It says he ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him. Now, again, this is the same purpose in my mind, because if you remember, Jacob and Esau were not on good terms. The last words that came out of Esau's mouth with Jacob living in the house was, "I want to kill him." I hope you've never legitimately said those words about a sibling, although if you have siblings, you've felt them, if we're honest with ourselves. So that was the last thing that we saw about Esau and Jacob, and so Jacob's walking into the situation probably freaking out, and the first thing that Esau does to know that he's accepted, he kisses him. So our greetings need to be marked by acceptance. I don't know if you felt the weight of being rejected before, or if you understand the importance of being accepted. There will be some questions provided, and one of them is unpacking that point. Why do we as people, and believers especially, need acceptance among other believers? I think it's really important for us to think about. But the second thing that kissing symbolized in the Bible is not just acceptance, but affection. Kissing communicates affection. Look at Luke 15, verse 20, or you can just listen along. This is the parable of the prodigal son. So it's not a literal father, but is a picture of our heavenly Father, how he views us and how he treats us. And we know the story. The son squanders everything, brings shame upon his family, ruins his life, and understands that he's probably only going to be rejected by his family. What does the father do? In verse 20, we see that the father, from a far distance off, ran to the son. And if you remember, in Jewish culture, it was not common and even frowned upon for Jewish men to run anywhere. It was a sense of dignity and pride that they would try to maintain, and running was not common. And so for a Jewish man to be running anywhere was already put people, they were confused, like, why would a man do this? And then he runs to him and embraces him and kisses him. He wants him to know not just that he's welcomed back, but that he loves him. Kissing was commanded in the New Testament times because it communicated affection. So we're going to be thinking about, well, does it have to be a kiss? I mean, what if Pastor Gary ate some onions? Do I have to give him a kiss? I mean, do I really have to do that? Can't it just be a fist bump? Pastor Jake, why do I have to do that? It doesn't have to be a kiss, but whatever it is, it needs to communicate acceptance, affection, and what we're going to look at right now is allegiance. It must communicate allegiance. How we greet one another, it needs to communicate this third thing. So in 1 Kings 19, we see this. If you remember how God promised that he would reserve 7,000 people who did not bow the knee to Baal. He describes these people who are set aside for God with two ways, and I just gave you the first one. The two things that he describes them with is they didn't bow the knee to Baal, so they didn't bow down and worship him. But the second thing is, in verse 18, it says this, and every mouth that has not kissed Baal. So these people who are pledging allegiance, if you will, to this false god did two things. They bowed the knee and they kissed him. You might be like, well, what were they doing? Why were they kissing this false god? Were they trying to show affection? Probably not, because most relationships between the false gods and just the Gentile world in that day, it was not a loving relationship at all. So it probably wasn't affection. Was it acceptance? Were they trying to say, we accept you, Baal? Probably not. I'm going to submit that they kissed it to pledge allegiance and identify with that false god. And then, of course, we see when Judas kisses Jesus, he was identifying himself with Jesus for the sake of the Roman guards to know who is the one that we need to betray. So we see allegiance, we see affection, and we see acceptance. And but let's think about for a moment, and we'll have some application, and we'll be done, a moment about the word holy. We understand that in those times they did a kiss. Does it have to be a kiss? Not necessarily. In other cultures, for instance, in Brazil, what they'll do is they'll have 3 kisses. One on one cheek, one on the other cheek, and one back on that first cheek. And it was always initiated by the women in that culture. There was a missionary to Ukraine who quickly realized that believers in Russia and Ukraine took this very seriously and literally. There was a big, burly Belarusian man who came up to him after a service one day and kissed him, not on the cheek, but on the lips, 3 times. There's another story about a man who was visiting some Polynesian islands and Polynesian cultures, and in their culture, it was custom for people to greet one another by rubbing noses together. If kissing on the cheek isn't hard enough, maybe rubbing noses might be the next option for you. So put it simply, it does not have to be a kiss. How did Paul want us to view it? He wanted it to be viewed through the lens of holiness. There's 3 thoughts about holiness, really quick. Holiness demands purity. Whatever form we use, it needs to be, first of all, pure in motive and pure in heart. Anytime we have contact with one another and we try to do ministry, we need to be pure. It's just like a surgeon. He would never perform surgery unless he was clean and the instruments that he uses are clean, right? Otherwise, you'd cause more harm and more damage than done. It's better off that some other surgeon does it who can have the proper sanitation. So it's, first of all, holiness means purity, but a holy kiss is also a sincere greeting. It demands sincerity. So many people say they don't want to go to church because of quote-unquote fake people. It's easy to spot and it's hard to fix, but we need to be sincere in our greetings. The last thing that holiness connotates, holiness demands intentionality. It won't happen naturally. That's why it's commanded 5 different times. If it's commanded once, that means we're probably going to have a hard time doing it. If it's commanded 5 times, that means it's going to be very difficult to do naturally. And so we see the importance of making it not just an affectionate and allegiant and even accepting greeting, but it must be holy. And I want to close our time with some brief application, and then we'll be done. There are 2 things that I want to put before you as some helpful takeaways. First of all, I want us to determine appropriate interaction with others. That was kind of wordy, but determine appropriate interaction with others. And 2 thoughts with that, okay? First of all, consider culture. So what will it look like on Guam to greet one another like this? Well, consider the cultural background of those in your group. There's going to be a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures and family upbringings and just customs. Consider that. But even amidst the cultures, consider conscience. Some people, even in a culture, may not be comfortable greeting in a certain way, so we need to consider those 2 things. Consider culture and consider conscience. And I want to leave you with these very practical steps. Not just determine appropriate interaction, but develop authentic interest in others. Some of you might be like, Jake, I understand the need. I'm just not interested enough to greet one another in an intentional way, in a meaningful way. It's so much easier to say, how are you doing? I'm doing well. How are you? I'm doing well. And to move on. It's so much easier. Well, how do we develop this interest? I think, first of all, we recognize that lack of interest. Typically, and this is borrowed from Gene Getz in his book on this topic, he says that we are not interested in others because we are too self-centered, but also we are too self-conscious. And those are different. Self-centered means you think too high of yourself. Self-conscious means that we think too low of ourselves. In either way, we are drawn away from sincerely greeting one another. So maybe make a note, which one do you struggle with more? And pray and ask for prayer for it. The second thing under how do you develop authentic interest? You remember their name. For some of you, getting the names of the people in your group is what you need to do today. And it's okay. Some you just met last week, but there should be no reason why you don't know everyone's name within a couple of months. Remembering the name is the best way, because we've all been in that situation where you see someone, you recognize them, and you can't remember the name for the life of you. And you try to play it off, you try to say maybe a nickname, or maybe you just say something, the first thing comes to your mind that was anything but their actual name, and they know, and you know that they know, and to avoid that, make an effort today to get to know their name. And the last 2 things is record one thing to follow up on. When you ask them and you learn their name, have the conversation long enough to have one thing to pray about. And then the last thing is have a conversation long enough to find one thing you can relate on. One thing you can relate on. Say, oh, you grew up here, I grew up there. Or I grew up in a very similar home. Or I experienced a similar thing when I played that sport, or I went to that college. Whatever it may be, intentionally look for one way that you can relate to them. So what is this first one another we can do? Is greet one another, specifically with a holy kiss, and we want people to feel welcomed, accepted, cared for, and cherished in all of our community groups. I pray this was an encouragement. I pray it was a help. Until next time, Lord bless.